I still remember the first time I saw her. Vivian Dawson, the matriarch of one of the wealthiest families in the country, the kind of woman whose name could open doors in every room you walked into. She wasn't just a grandmother, she was a symbol, a legend even. But that day she was lying in a hospital bed surrounded by doctors, 10 of them to be exact, each one of them more experienced and educated than the next, but none of them could figure out what was happening to her. They'd tried everything, medications, treatments, diagnostics that were supposed to be foolproof, and yet she was only getting worse. She had been in and out of consciousness for days, and I could tell from the look in the doctor's eyes. They were out of ideas. I wasn't supposed to be there, of course. I was just the hired help, the man who drove the family's cars, cleaned their windows, and occasionally did odd jobs around the estate. But I had spent enough time with Vivian over the years to know how much she meant to her family, to her grandchildren, and when I got the call asking me to come to the hospital, I didn't think twice. What I didn't know, however, was that this situation would change everything. At first glance, Vivian didn't seem like the type of person who would be in trouble. She was always so vibrant, so full of life. Even in her older years, she had that charisma, but today, all of that was gone. Her skin was pale, and there was no trace of the fire she had once carried. And those doctors, they were stumped. For the first time in their careers, they couldn't figure it out. They were doing everything they could, checking vitals, adjusting medications, taking blood samples. But it was as if her body was rejecting their every attempt. Now, I had seen a lot in my life. I grew up in neighborhoods where you didn't have the luxury of medical insurance or access to the best doctors. You learned early on that survival wasn't just about being physically strong. It was about paying attention, listening to the world around you. That's something I learned from my mother, a woman who worked 2 jobs to put food on the table, but could somehow always tell when something was off, even when no one else saw it. She didn't have fancy degrees or titles, but she had something that none of those doctors had, intuition. So when I saw Vivian's condition, something didn't feel right. It wasn't the disease, it was the way they were going about trying to save her. They were looking in all the wrong places. I could see the doctor's frustration. One of them, Dr. Peterson, a man in his late 40s, tried to explain to the family that they were doing everything they could, but there was only so much they could do. His voice was confident, but it didn't reach his eyes. They were filled with doubt. He knew he was running out of options. I've never been one to back down. I wasn't a doctor, but I had spent enough time in hospitals, enough time watching people who knew how to read the signs to know when something wasn't being seen. And in that moment, I couldn't ignore it. I had to step in. I approached Dr. Peterson quietly, trying not to draw attention to myself. I could see that he was on edge. His lab coat was slightly wrinkled, his glasses sitting too low on his nose. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Dr. Peterson, I said, my voice steady but careful, not wanting to overstep. He turned and gave me a look that said, "Who is this guy?" but also a hint of curiosity, like he knew something was missing. Yes? I think it's the medication, I said. I didn't know exactly why I said it, but the moment I said it, I felt like something clicked. He raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? I think it's the dosage. It's too high. Her body can't handle it. Dr. Peterson glanced at me, his expression a mixture of surprise and skepticism. What makes you think you know more than 10 medical professionals? He asked, clearly irritated. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I just pointed to the IV drip in Vivian's arm. It's her treatment. The rate's too fast. Her body's rejecting it. The heart monitor is a sign that it's too much. It's overwhelming her system. He scoffed at first, dismissing me as someone who had no idea what he was talking about. But then, something in his eyes softened. I had his attention. "How do you know this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more curious than judgmental. I glanced at Vivian, then back at Dr. Peterson. "I just know. I've seen it happen before." He stared at me for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised me. He took a step back. He called for the nurse to adjust the drip. I stood there in silence as the nurse followed his orders and made the change. Dr. Peterson stayed next to me, his face a picture of concentration. And then, something incredible happened. I watched as Vivian's heart rate slowly started to stabilize. Her color returned to her face, the tension in her body easing. The room fell quiet again. The doctors looked at each other in disbelief. Dr. Peterson's expression was hard to read. But as the nurse checked the vitals again, a wave of relief washed over him. "It's working," he said almost to himself. "How did you know?" I didn't have a good answer for him. I wasn't a doctor. I couldn't explain why I felt the way I did, but there was something about Vivian's pulse, something about the way she had been responding that had told me the truth. It wasn't a medical degree that helped me. It was the ability to pay attention, to listen to the situation, to feel what was happening. The doctors began to recalibrate, adjusting their approach, but for me, the biggest moment had already passed. Vivian had been saved, not by their fancy equipment or advanced degrees, but by something much simpler. As the minutes passed, the room seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. Vivian's vitals continued to stabilize. The beeping of the heart monitor slowed down to a steady rhythm, and her color returned to a healthier shade. The doctors, who had been so confident in their expertise, now seemed like they were trying to process what had just happened. They didn't quite understand how a simple observation, something so basic, had made all the difference. Dr. Peterson turned to me, still in shock but grateful. "I have to admit, I didn't see that," he said, his tone less defensive now. "You were right." I nodded quietly, still processing what had occurred. Vivian was stable, and that was all that mattered. But in my mind, something deeper had happened. I wasn't just an outsider anymore. I had done something that even the most educated and experienced doctors couldn't do. I had made a difference, not with fancy knowledge, but with the simplest of skills, paying attention and trusting my instincts. The nurses continued to monitor Vivian, adjusting her treatment in small increments to make sure the change wouldn't overload her system again. "Doctor?" Peterson gathered the other doctors, talking in low voices about what had happened, discussing the changes they would make to her treatment plan. I could hear them acknowledging the mistake, recalculating their approach, and rethinking their assumptions. I stepped away from the scene for a moment, giving them space to work, but I couldn't help but overhear a bit of their conversation. This isn't just about medicine, it's about the whole picture. Sometimes we get too focused on the tech, the diagnostics, and miss the signs that are right in front of us, one of the doctors said, echoing my own thoughts. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel a sense of pride. It wasn't about ego, it was about something much bigger. It was about seeing people for who they are, beyond their wealth, beyond their titles. A few minutes later, William Dornelles, Vivian's grandson and the billionaire behind the family name, entered the room. He had arrived earlier, but he had been waiting in the waiting room, pacing nervously as anyone would when someone so important was in danger. The tension on his face was replaced with a quiet relief as he saw his grandmother's vitals steady on the monitor. "She's stable," Dr. Peterson reported a little hesitantly but with obvious relief in his voice. "The medication is being adjusted and she's responding well." William turned to me, his expression softening as he took in the situation. "I'm not sure what just happened, but thank you. I don't know how you saw it, but you saved her life." I wasn't used to hearing words like that, and truthfully, I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't looking for recognition. I had done what I thought needed to be done, but hearing him speak that way made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt before. "I just did what seemed right," I said quietly, my voice steady. "I saw something wasn't right, and I acted on it." It's what anyone would do, really. But William Dornelles was already looking at me with a new understanding, a new respect. There was no pity, no condescension, just acknowledgement. For the first time, he didn't see me as just the hired help, the chauffeur's son. He saw me as someone who had just done something extraordinary. And not because I had degrees or formal training, but because I had something that couldn't be measured, awareness. The rest of the day was a blur. The doctors continued to monitor Vivian, making small adjustments to her care, and the family settled into the waiting room, their anxiety giving way to cautious optimism. By the time evening came, Vivian was fully conscious, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around the room, confused at first, and then her gaze landed on William, who was standing by her bedside, looking relieved. "Grandma?" he said, his voice soft. "William." "What happened?" she asked, her voice frail but still strong. She was awake, but the effects of the illness hadn't completely worn off yet. The family gathered around, telling her everything, explaining how the doctors had been unsure of what to do, but how things changed when a familiar face stepped in. William paused for a moment before turning to me, his eyes locking with mine. He didn't need to say anything more. I simply nodded and stepped back, quietly slipping out of the room. My job had been done. I had done what no one expected, and now Vivian was safe. But something else had changed too, my own understanding of what it meant to make a difference. The days that followed felt surreal. Vivian's recovery was steady, and the family had already started to reevaluate their approach to healthcare, making sure they never again took their doctor's advice at face value without considering the bigger picture. I couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in the way they treated me. William approached me a few days later, this time with more than just gratitude in his eyes. There was a recognition there, something deeper than words could express. "I've been thinking about it a lot, Carlos," he said. "I owe you more than just my thanks. You saved my grandmother's life, yes, but you also opened my eyes to something far more important. You taught me that sometimes it's the simplest things, the small details that make the biggest difference." And I've been blind to that for so long. I wasn't sure what to say to him. I wasn't the one who saved Vivian. She had her own strength, her own will to fight. I had just been the one who noticed what no one else did. But hearing him speak like this felt strange. It felt like something I had always known was finally being acknowledged. "It's about the people, not the numbers," I said, reflecting on everything that had happened. The doctors got so caught up in all the technical stuff that they missed what was in front of them. It wasn't about what they had learned in textbooks. It was about paying attention to the person. William's eyes met mine again, and for a second I saw a flicker of understanding. The days after Vivian's recovery were filled with a strange sense of calm. The Dornell's family had finally seen the human side of medicine, and there was a newfound appreciation for not just the scientific knowledge, but for the intuition and the human connection that often gets overlooked in the pursuit of quick fixes. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how right I was when I stepped in. This wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a failure to see the bigger picture. Vivian's health had been saved, not by the doctor's advanced equipment, but by something much simpler, awareness and empathy. But there was one more thing I couldn't shake from my mind, William's transformation. It wasn't just about the gratitude he showed me for saving his grandmother. That was expected. No, what had struck me was the shift in his perspective. He was a billionaire, one of the wealthiest men in the country, used to living in a world where money and power were the solutions to everything. But in the face of a life or death situation, he had learned something invaluable. That human connection was just as important as wealth, if not more. I continued to help the family, as I had always done, but now there was something different about the way they treated me. They weren't just treating me like a servant anymore. William, in particular, seemed to view me in a new light, more like an equal, someone whose opinion mattered. A few weeks later, I was in the family's estate, taking care of some errands, when I received a message from William. His words were short but clear. "Meet me in my office." I wasn't sure what to expect. I had been helping with some of the family's logistics and operations, but this felt different. His tone, the urgency, suggested something bigger was on the horizon. When I entered his office, he was sitting at his desk, looking out the large windows that overlooked the sprawling estate. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over everything, but there was an unmistakable tension in his posture. "Carlos," he said, not turning from the window, "I need to talk to you about something important." I took a seat, unsure of what was coming. "What's going on?" I asked. He turned to me, and for the first time, I saw a different side of him, a side that wasn't about wealth or power. There was something raw in his eyes, something vulnerable. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Vivian," he began, "about how you stepped in when no one else did, how you saw what we missed, and it made me realize something." I waited, feeling a sense of anticipation building. I had learned not to rush people, to let them speak at their own pace, so I kept quiet and let him continue. "You saved her life, Carlos, but you also changed the way I see everything," he said. "You've shown me that success isn't about just being the smartest or the most powerful. It's about being aware, about truly understanding what people need and seeing the things that others ignore. I've spent so much of my life focused on being successful in terms of money and business, but I've neglected the human side of things." I felt a lump form in my throat. This wasn't just gratitude, it was a deep emotional acknowledgement of the impact I had made, and I wasn't sure how to respond. But then William spoke again, and what he said next left me speechless. "I want you to take a bigger role in this company, Carlos. I don't want you just as an advisor. I want you to help shape the culture here. I want you to teach our employees the same things you taught me. I need you to help me build a company that isn't just about numbers, but about people. A company that understands that the most important thing is how we make others feel." I sat there stunned, my mind racing. This wasn't just an offer to be a higher up in the company. This was a chance to reshape everything. To create a company that would lead not just with its products or profits, but with human connection at its core. I'm offering you a chance to make a real difference. William continued, his eyes serious. To shape this company's future in a way that goes beyond the bottom line. You've already shown me what true success is. Now I want you to show everyone else. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Just a few months ago, I was a guy who did odd jobs for the family, an outsider. Now, here I was, being offered the opportunity to reshape the very culture of a billion-dollar empire. I won't let you down, William, I said, my voice filled with determination. I'll do whatever it takes to help this company see what really matters. In the following months, my role within the company grew in ways I couldn't have imagined. I worked closely with the leadership team, helping them rethink everything, from how we treated our employees to how we interacted with our customers. It wasn't easy, but every step was worth it. We started implementing policies that prioritized empathy, understanding, and human connection. I organized workshops for the team, focusing on how to engage with others on a deeper level, how to listen and understand needs rather than just seeing people as resources. We created a culture where employees weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they were people. Their happiness, their fulfillment, their sense of purpose was just as important as the company's profits. As the company grew, so did the impact we had on the world. The changes weren't just felt internally, they spread outward. Our clients, our partners, and even our competitors started noticing the difference. They saw a company that didn't just care about making money, they saw a company that cared about creating something that mattered. I began to realize that this was my true purpose. Not just in the company, but in life. It wasn't about money or success. It was about the people we touched, the way we helped them feel seen and heard. That was the true measure of success. And it all started because of one simple observation, one moment when I looked past the technicalities and saw the human side of a situation. I had helped save Vivian, yes, but I had also helped change the way an entire company saw success. And that impact would last far longer than any profit margin. The first few months in my new role felt like I was walking on uncharted ground. The weight of the responsibility wasn't something I took lightly. I wasn't just trying to change a company's internal culture. I was on a mission to reshape the way people thought about business success. Human connection had become the central focus, and with that came the challenge of translating this vision into something tangible. I spent countless hours with the leadership team, working on strategies that would intertwine this new way of thinking into every part of the business. We redefined our mission, our vision, and our core values. Our new mission wasn't just about profitability, it was about creating a culture that cared. A culture that would extend to every employee, every customer, and even our competitors. We made it a priority to listen. We hosted forums where employees could voice their opinions without fear of judgment or repercussions. We started conducting employee surveys that weren't just about job satisfaction. They focused on their emotional well-being, their purpose within the company, and their relationships with their coworkers. It was a complete 180-degree shift from the old way of doing things, and at first the results weren't exactly what we had hoped for. The transition was hard. We were changing the very foundation of the company, and it wasn't always easy to convince everyone that this was the right approach. But that's when the unexpected happened. Our customers started noticing. It began with small comments from clients, compliments that seemed like passing remarks at first. "I can feel the difference in your team," one of our longtime clients said. "There's a sense of community here that I haven't seen in years." Then came the referrals. Word started to spread that our company wasn't just another faceless corporation. We had become a business that people trusted. We had a reputation for caring, not just about their business, but about them as individuals. Our customers began to connect with us on a level we hadn't expected. The shift wasn't just internal, it was felt everywhere. I remember the first time one of our competitors reached out to us. It wasn't for a business deal or a merger. They wanted advice. They wanted to understand how we had turned our culture around so quickly, how we had connected so deeply with our employees and customers. They were struggling with low employee morale, high turnover, and dwindling customer loyalty. I had to smile to myself, realizing that the company I had once viewed from the outside with a desire to fit in and be recognized had become something entirely different. We had become the company that others looked up to, not because of our wealth or power, but because of the culture we had created. But the most rewarding part of all this? The personal transformations. As I worked alongside William Dornelles, I saw how he had changed, not just as a businessman, but as a person. He had once been obsessed with numbers and profits, always chasing after the next big deal, the next big growth opportunity. But now, I saw him actively engage with employees, asking them about their well-being, understanding their concerns, and truly listening. He was no longer the detached billionaire. He was now the leader who cared. One evening, after a long day of meetings, William and I sat in his office overlooking the city. It was a rare moment of quiet between us. He poured us both a drink, a gesture that had become a ritual of sorts after a long day of work. "Carlos," he began, his voice thoughtful. "I've been reflecting a lot on everything we've accomplished together, but what strikes me the most is how much I've changed through this process." I looked at him, not sure where he was going with this, but I could tell he was genuinely introspective. I was so focused on success, on winning, that I lost sight of what was truly important. And now, as I look at the company, I realize that the real success wasn't in the deals we closed or the money we made. It was in the relationships we built, the way we've made our people feel valued, and how we've turned this company into a place where people want to work and grow. His words hit me harder than I expected. William wasn't just acknowledging the success of the company, he was acknowledging his own transformation, something he had never done before. We sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging between us, and then he looked at me again, his eyes filled with sincerity. "You've changed the course of this company, Carlos, and you've changed me. You've shown me that real leadership isn't about power or control. It's about compassion, listening, and showing up for your people." I wasn't sure how to respond. This was the man who had started it all, who had built an empire. And yet, in that moment, I realized that he was no longer the same person who had hired me as the chauffeur's son. "Thank you, but it's not just me," I replied. "This change is because we made the decision to truly see people, and it's what you've done as a leader that's made the difference. You believed in this transformation. Without your support, none of this would have been possible." That night, as I left the office, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt before. This journey, this transformation, hadn't just been about me proving my worth. It had been about creating something meaningful, not just for the company, but for the people who had become a part of it. I had learned that true success wasn't about how many zeros were in a bank account or how big your name appeared on a list. It was about the impact you had on others, the legacy you left behind, and how you made people feel in the process. The days following that conversation with William were a blur of momentum. Every meeting felt charged with purpose. Every conversation with the leadership team centered around the next steps in shaping the company's future. The company was no longer just about growth for the sake of growth. It was about creating something sustainable, something meaningful. I began to see changes ripple through not only the business, but in the lives of the people around me. People were more engaged, more passionate about their work. They weren't just clocking in and out, they were truly invested. But with that change came challenges. Some were subtle, some were glaring. As we tried to shift the company culture, there were moments when old habits resurfaced. The focus on numbers, on quarterly profits, seemed to pull us back. There were days when I would walk into a meeting and I could feel the old corporate energy. People talked about goals, about financial forecasts, and the importance of hitting targets. And in those moments, I had to remind myself that we weren't just about the money anymore. We had to find the balance to achieve success, but not at the cost of our humanity. It was during one of those moments that I realized how far we still had to go. We had started the shift, but the real work was just beginning. The old systems were deeply embedded, and as much as we wanted change, it would take time to completely rewrite the way we did business. But just as quickly as I felt the weight of those challenges, I saw the fruits of our labor. One morning, I was walking through the office when I overheard a conversation that stopped me in my tracks. One of the employees, Maria, a young woman who had been with the company for a few years, was talking with her colleague. "You know, I used to dread coming in here," she said. "But now, I actually look forward to my day. I feel like what I do matters, and that's a big change for me. I feel heard. I feel like I'm part of something." It wasn't the first time I had heard something like that, but something about hearing it from her, someone who had seen the company's old culture, struck me deeply. Maria's words reminded me why we were doing this. The impact of our shift was tangible. People were beginning to see that they mattered. They weren't just employees. They were people with stories, dreams, and a voice that was being heard. And then came another breakthrough. William came to me one evening with an idea, a vision that had been brewing in his mind for weeks. He was always quick to adapt, but there was something about this idea that felt different. It wasn't just about changing the company. It was about changing the industry. He called me into his office late one Friday evening. The city lights outside reflected off the glass walls, casting a warm, golden glow in the room. It was quiet, the way it often gets when everyone else is gone, and the weight of the week begins to settle. "Carlos," he said, looking out the window, his tone quieter than usual. "I've been thinking about how we can do more than just change our culture internally, how we can make this movement bigger. The world needs more of what we're doing here." I could feel the passion in his words, and for the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about our company anymore. It was about creating a new standard, a new kind of business. "What do you mean?" I asked, intrigued. He turned to me, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I think we need to start a foundation, a nonprofit that focuses on helping businesses adopt this new way of thinking, one that puts people first. We can show others that success isn't just about profits, but about creating a culture of care and connection." The idea was both overwhelming and exhilarating. A foundation, a chance to build something bigger than what we had already accomplished. We weren't just changing the way our company did business. We could change the whole industry. "It's a huge leap," I said, pacing for a moment as I thought about it. "But it's exactly what we need to do." "Exactly," William said, his eyes lighting up. "If we can get this right, we can inspire a movement. We'll be setting an example for others to follow. We'll show them that businesses can be successful and still prioritize human well-being. We can be a model for the world." I could see the vision clearly now. We could make a real difference. Not just for us, but for everyone. This wasn't about getting accolades or recognition. It was about creating a lasting legacy, one that would leave an imprint on the business world. In the weeks that followed, we set the foundation in motion. The logistics were complex, writing proposals, gathering resources, building a team. But with William's drive and the support of our leadership team, we moved quickly. Our goal was simple: to teach businesses how to balance profit with purpose. We launched the People First Initiative, a program designed to help companies understand that true success came from creating a culture that valued their employees' well-being, fostering meaningful connections, and focusing on human-centered leadership. It was a monumental task, but we had the experience of transforming our own company behind us. We knew the road wouldn't be easy, but we were willing to take it. As we began working with other companies, I saw how our message started to resonate with them. Corporate leaders, once skeptical, began to see the truth in our approach. The idea of focusing on human connection over financial success didn't just make sense. It made them realize that their businesses could be more sustainable, more resilient, and more impactful by prioritizing people. One afternoon, a year after we had launched the initiative, I stood at the front of a conference room filled with leaders from various industries. I looked out at them, at the faces of men and women who had come to believe in something bigger than profits, and I felt a sense of pride. We had come so far, and in that moment, I knew we had made an impact. We had not only changed a company, not only changed William Dornell's, but we had started a movement that was changing the world. The next few years were a whirlwind of growth and challenges. The People First Initiative began to take off, not just in the United States, but across the globe. More and more companies began reaching out to us, eager to learn how they could create better, more meaningful connections with their employees and customers. At first, I thought it was a trend, something companies would try for a few months and then forget about. But something surprising happened. The movement stuck. Companies weren't just adopting our practices, they were embracing them. I had always believed that change was possible, but seeing it happen at such a large scale felt almost surreal. We were creating ripples across industries, helping businesses understand that profitability didn't have to come at the cost of people's well-being. The more I worked with other businesses, the more I saw how ingrained the traditional mindset had been. For decades, companies had been focused solely on the bottom line, on growth, metrics, numbers. They treated their employees as resources to be maximized, their customers as targets to be sold to. But now, they were beginning to understand that without engaged employees, without loyal customers, and without true human connection, they were setting themselves up for failure in the long run. It wasn't just a philosophical shift, it was a practical one. Companies began to see a direct correlation between employee satisfaction and productivity. When workers felt valued and heard, they went above and beyond. Customer satisfaction soared when companies genuinely cared about their needs, listened to their feedback, and built relationships based on trust. One of the most memorable moments of the initiative's success came when we received a letter from a company in Brazil, a family-owned business in the retail sector that had been struggling for years. They had fallen behind their competitors, losing customers to bigger, more aggressive companies. But after participating in our program, they transformed. They implemented a people-first approach, focusing on customer relationships, employee well-being, and creating a strong company culture. The letter thanked us for helping them find their soul again, and how in just 6 months their profits had not only increased, but they had become one of the most beloved brands in the region. Their employees felt empowered, their customers were loyal, and the leadership team was finally aligned with the company's core values. That letter was a turning point for me. It wasn't just about one company anymore. It was about a global shift in the way business was done. It was about showing the world that you could still build an empire and do it the right way. As I sat in the conference room one day, reviewing a report on our most recent partnerships, I looked up at the faces of the team we had built. These were the same people who had stood with me when the transformation was just a thought in our minds. Now, we were leaders in this movement, helping companies across the world shift their priorities. William Dornelles had always been the driving force behind the financial side of things, but now it was clear that he had become a true advocate for this new vision. He had fully embraced the change, and it was remarkable to see how his leadership had grown. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a humanitarian leader who understood that the wealth of a company meant little if it wasn't used to improve the lives of those within and around it. One day, as we were finalizing a new partnership with a company in Europe, William sat across from me with that familiar glint of excitement in his eyes. "Carlos," he said, his voice filled with a mix of pride and awe. "Do you realize what we've done? We've built something that could change the way the world does business. And it's not just about money. It's about creating a legacy of compassion, of connection." It was the first time in a long while that I saw him look at our work in the way I did. This was his transformation. This wasn't just a billion-dollar deal. It wasn't just another business transaction. We had done something far more profound. "We've created something meaningful, William. And that's the most important thing of all," I said, the words feeling more real than ever before. As we continued to work, the stories of companies transforming through our People First initiative became more frequent. It wasn't just about changing how businesses operated. It was about changing how we viewed success. It was about leaving a legacy that would be remembered for years to come. Not for the money we made, but for the impact we had on people's lives. At the heart of it all, I kept returning to what had started it all, a simple observation. A small but crucial detail that no one else had noticed. Vivian's life had been saved because I had paid attention, because I had trusted my instincts and understood that people aren't just numbers. They are human beings with emotions, with needs, and with stories that deserve to be heard. And from that moment on, I knew that my purpose in life was not just about doing the work. It was about changing the world in the way I knew best, through human connection. Years later, as I walked through the offices of Dornelles Inc., the company I had helped transform, I saw the familiar faces of employees smiling, collaborating, and truly thriving. They weren't just working for a paycheck, they were working because they believed in something. And that was the true power of what we had built. The journey from that moment in the hospital room where I stepped in to save Vivian had led me to something far beyond what I ever could have imagined. It had led me to a life where the true measure of success was not in wealth or accolades, but in the impact you make on others. And as I looked around at the thriving company, the vibrant community of people who had been touched by this movement, I realized that I had been part of something far greater than myself. I had changed the world. The years that followed were a blur of constant growth, expansion, and, most importantly, evolution. The People First initiative had taken on a life of its own. The companies we worked with, big and small, were seeing results that couldn't be ignored. Employee engagement soared, productivity increased, and customer satisfaction reached new heights. We had created a new standard for businesses around the world, and while I knew that we had accomplished something extraordinary, the weight of that accomplishment wasn't what drove me. What drove me was the deeper connection I had begun to build with those around me. The transformation wasn't just about the company, or the money, or even the global movement we had created. It was about the relationships, the personal stories of success, struggles, and perseverance. One evening, after a long day of meetings and phone calls, I found myself alone in William's office once again. The world outside the windows had turned dark, the city lights twinkling below. It was one of those rare moments of quiet amidst the chaos. William was at his desk, looking over some figures on his laptop, but when he saw me walk in, he pushed the screen aside and smiled. I've been thinking about the journey, Carlos, he said, his voice reflective. How far we've come, from the moment you stepped in to help save Vivian to what we've built today. It's incredible. I took a seat across from him, noticing the calmness in his demeanor, something that wasn't always there before. It's been quite the journey, I said, but it's not over, is it? We've started something that I think can continue growing, evolving. I feel like we're just scratching the surface of what we can do. He nodded thoughtfully. You're right, we've built something that has the potential to touch millions of lives, but it's up to us to keep pushing it forward. What we're doing here isn't just a one-time success. It's a movement that will change how businesses operate forever. There was a pause, and I could see him lost in thought. It was the first time I saw him vulnerable, like the weight of everything we had accomplished was hitting him as it had hit me. We had changed the game, not just in business, but in how people interact with each other in the workplace, and even outside of it. We had shown the world that success wasn't just a dollar sign. It was about human connection, about building relationships that mattered, but with that realization came new questions. The future, for the first time, seemed uncertain. We had done so much, and yet there was so much left to do. The business world was starting to listen, but how long would it take for the entire industry to follow? Would the change we had started stick? Would it inspire more than just a few companies to shift their priorities? I could see the same questions running through William's mind. What's next? He asked quietly, looking at me. How do we keep this going? How do we make sure that what we've built isn't just a passing trend? I took a deep breath. The question was the one I had been asking myself for weeks. I had always been a man of action, but the deeper I dove into this transformation, the more I realized that the work was never really done. It wasn't about the accolades, the recognition, or the awards. It was about creating a lasting legacy of compassion, empathy, and true success. We keep pushing, William, I said firmly. We keep leading by example. We create new opportunities for businesses to adopt this model. We make sure the people-first philosophy is integrated into every facet of society, not just the workplace, but in schools, in communities, in governments. It's about creating a world where human connection is the foundation for everything. He leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly, the weight of my words sinking in. We both knew the scale of what we were talking about, but for the first time, William Dornell seemed ready for it. There was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet, determined resolve. You're right, he said. We've got a bigger purpose now. That night, as I left the office, I walked out into the cool night air, feeling both heavy and hopeful. The city around me was alive, but I couldn't help but feel like the world was quieter in some ways. I had done what I set out to do. I had helped create a movement, but I knew that the true impact would take years to fully materialize, and that was fine. Because I had learned the most important lesson of all. True success isn't measured by how many zeros are in your bank account or by how many deals you close. It's measured by the difference you make in the lives of others. It's measured by the connections you foster, the people you inspire, and the legacy of compassion you leave behind. A few months later, we held the first official People First Summit, a gathering of business leaders, innovators, and thinkers from all over the world, united by a common vision to change the way business is done. As I stood there on stage, looking out at the crowd, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. We had created something real, something that would live on beyond us. But more than that, I realized that this was just the beginning. The work was still ahead of us. We would continue to fight for the people-first philosophy, continue to spread the message that the future of business is in human connection. And as I look back at the faces of the people who had been with me since the beginning, William, our leadership team, the employees, and even our competitors, I knew we had made the right choice. We had started something that would forever change how people saw success. And in doing so, we had begun to change the world. As the People First Summit wrapped up, I stood outside, watching as groups of attendees gathered in the lobby, exchanging business cards and discussing the new ideas they had learned. There was a tangible energy in the air, something that felt different from the typical corporate events I had attended in the past. People weren't just interested in the financial gains or the next big deal. They were genuinely talking about how they could apply what they had learned to make a difference in their companies, their communities, and the world. For the first time, I realized the full scope of the movement we had started. It wasn't about me, or William Dornell's, or even the Dornell's family. It was about people, the employees, the customers, the partners, the people we had impacted along the way. This wasn't a one-time initiative. This was a shift in mindset that would continue to grow long after we were gone. As the night grew later and the event came to a close, I found myself in a quiet corner of the hotel, reflecting on everything that had happened. The road had been long and full of challenges, but the changes we had made were undeniable. The people first philosophy was no longer just an idea. It was a reality, and it was spreading. I was lost in thought when I heard footsteps approaching. I turned to find William, his expression tired but content. There was a sense of peace in him that I hadn't seen before. The man who once seemed obsessed with business growth had now found something more important: purpose. "Carlos," he said as he walked up, his voice calm. "We did it." I nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "We've only just begun," I replied. "This movement isn't about us anymore. It's about what we leave behind." He smiled, looking around at the group still gathered in the conference hall. "You're right, we've set something in motion that I don't think will ever be the same. People will continue to build on this. It'll grow beyond what we ever imagined." The truth hit me with a quiet force. This wasn't just about our company. It was about changing the way the world thought about success, about shifting from a profit-driven mentality to a people-driven one. And that shift wasn't limited to a few companies. It was now a global conversation. Over the next few months, the People First initiative continued to gather momentum. More companies joined the movement, and more success stories came in. We began receiving messages from all over the world, from startups in Africa to established corporations in Asia, all asking how they could integrate this new approach into their businesses. It was as if a fire had been lit, and people everywhere were eager to join, but it wasn't without its struggles. As the movement grew, we encountered resistance. Some businesses were too entrenched in the old way of thinking to embrace this shift. Others were skeptical, worried about the long-term viability of prioritizing people over profits. There were moments when I doubted if we could reach everyone, when I questioned if we were on the right path. Then, one day I received a call from a small company in Michigan, a business that had been on the brink of bankruptcy just a few months ago. They were struggling to stay afloat, unable to retain employees, and facing an increasingly disengaged customer base. But after joining the People First movement, everything changed. The owner explained how they had implemented changes to improve employee well-being, introduced new training programs, and focused on fostering genuine relationships with customers. Within months, the company had turned around. They were now thriving. And the best part? The employees were happier than they had been in years. They felt valued, heard, and most importantly, cared for. That call was the turning point I needed. It reminded me that small businesses could be just as powerful in spreading this message as large corporations. The shift wasn't just about changing the big players in the industry. It was about helping everyone, from small family-owned shops to massive multinational corporations, see the power of people-centered leadership. As we grew, William and I continued to work closely, but something had shifted between us. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about something far deeper. We had created a legacy together, one that would transcend our time and efforts. And as I sat in his office one afternoon, I couldn't help but think about how far we had come. "William, do you remember the first time we spoke about this?" I asked, smiling to myself. He chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Of course. You walked into my office and told me something that completely flipped my world upside down. I thought you were crazy, but look at us now. I never could have imagined it would grow into this." I nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over me. We've built something that will last. Not just a company, but a movement that can truly change the way people live and work. And with that, we both knew that our work was far from over. The world was waking up to the reality that true success came from the way we treated each other, not just as employees or customers, but as human beings. The People First initiative wasn't just a business philosophy, it was a movement for humanity. As the years went by, the People First philosophy continued to spread, and I found myself stepping back more and more. William had become a leader not just in the corporate world, but in humanity's journey toward compassion and empathy. He had finally realized that the real power wasn't in the wealth he had built, but in the lives he had touched. And I had the honor of being there, at the heart of it all, watching a dream become a global reality. But the most significant lesson I had learned was that success was never about the destination. It was about the journey, about how we treat one another, how we lift each other up, and how we create a world where people matter more than profits. It was about creating something that wasn't just for us, but for the generations that would follow. And that, I realized, was the true meaning of success. Years passed, and the People First initiative became more than just a movement. It became a way of life for businesses worldwide. I found myself increasingly removed from the day-to-day operations of the organization, but I was still deeply involved in guiding the overarching vision. In a strange way, I had become something of a symbol, the man who had started as the chauffeur's son and had risen to a place where his ideas could change the way the world worked. But even as the movement spread, there was always a feeling that something new was on the horizon, something that would push us all to evolve once again. I remember the day it came, clear as daylight, like a shift in the air. William called me into his office, looking as composed as ever, but with something different in his eyes. "Carlos," he began, the weight of the moment clear in his voice. "We've built something incredible, but I think it's time for us to push even further." I looked at him, sensing what was coming. There had been a subtle shift in his tone over the last few months. It was as if he was standing on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. "What are you thinking?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. He stood up, walking over to the window and gazing out at the skyline. "I've been reflecting on all that we've accomplished. We've changed businesses, sure. We've changed lives. But now, I think we need to shift the focus. We need to make human connection the centerpiece of not just companies, but entire communities. I want us to help change the way governments think about their citizens. I want to create global networks where this philosophy is not just adopted in business, but also in public policy. It's time for a new world order, one built on compassion, empathy, and connection." I was struck silent. This wasn't just an idea. It was a vision for the future of humanity. For years, we had been focused on businesses, teaching them that success was about caring for their employees and customers. But now, William wanted to take it beyond that, to change how the world governed itself. "William, are you talking about policy changes? International reforms?" I asked, still processing what he was suggesting. He nodded, turning back to face me. "Exactly. It's bigger than business. The world needs to learn how to care for people at the most fundamental levels. I want to create a platform that allows world leaders to adopt the people-first philosophy in their own countries. We can't just change the private sector. We need to change the world." That conversation marked the beginning of something new. We began to meet with international organizations, government officials, and NGOs, exploring how we could bring people first into the global dialogue. At first, the task seemed impossible. The political world was so divided, so focused on short-term agendas. How could we possibly convince leaders, whose very power depended on public opinion and financial interests, to prioritize human connection over profits or political gain? But as we began to speak with more people, the idea began to take root. We started working with countries like Denmark and New Zealand, who already had a strong focus on well-being, and we showed them how our people-first philosophy could further enrich their societies. We also reached out to places like South Africa and Brazil, where large inequalities existed, and our message was received with enthusiasm. The turning point came when the United Nations invited us to present at their annual Global Leader Summit. This was the moment we had been waiting for, a chance to speak to the world's most influential leaders about the power of human connection and how it could transform economies, reduce poverty, and build a more equitable society. As I stood at the podium, speaking to an audience of world leaders, diplomats, and changemakers, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we had come. Just a few years ago, I was the guy in the back of the room, the chauffeur's son trying to make a difference. And now, I was standing in front of the people who controlled the fate of nations. But this wasn't about me. It wasn't about William either. It was about the future we were trying to build, a future where people's needs came first, before profits, before political agendas, before everything else. What if we measured the success of nations by how they treat their citizens? What if we put well-being at the forefront of every policy, every decision, and every strategy? I asked the crowd. The time has come to shift our focus. We have the power to create a world that values its people, that leads with compassion, and that ensures no one is left behind. We can build a society where human connection is at the heart of everything. And if we can do that, imagine what we could achieve. The room was silent for a moment, but the applause that followed was deafening. It wasn't just a ceremonial gesture, it was real. The leaders in the room understood that the world needed to change. They were ready to listen, ready to shift their focus toward what truly mattered. The next few years were a blur of global meetings, speaking engagements, and collaborations. We worked with countries to draft policies that focused on education, healthcare, sustainability, and economic reform, all underpinned by the people-first ideology. William and I traveled the world, meeting with leaders, sharing our vision, and helping them implement these ideas. It wasn't always easy. The road to changing entire systems of governance was fraught with political pushback, but we never wavered, and then came the day that made everything worth it, the first Global People First Summit held in Geneva. It wasn't just a gathering of businesses or government officials. It was a global movement. We had leaders from every continent, and the focus was clear: human well-being as the foundation for global success. I watched as people from all walks of life, politicians, entrepreneurs, activists, and community leaders came together, united by one simple idea: the world could be a better place if we prioritize people over profits. In the end, we had achieved more than I could have ever imagined. We had built something that wasn't just a business philosophy, it had become a global movement. People First wasn't just an initiative, it was a force for change. And in a way, it had changed me too. When I started this journey, I was just a kid who wanted to make a difference. But now I realize that the true meaning of success wasn't in how much money you made or how many people knew your name. It was about how many lives you touched. And as I walked out of the summit with the weight of everything we had accomplished, I knew one thing for sure: the future was in good hands. The months following the Global People First Summit were filled with a renewed sense of urgency. The momentum we had built was undeniable, but the work was just beginning. Our goal wasn't just to inspire change, it was to ensure that change was sustained. We needed to continue influencing global systems, pushing for long-term reform. But with that came a whole new set of challenges. The initial success was electrifying. Countries were beginning to adopt policies based on our model, and I received countless calls from government leaders, CEOs, and NGO directors eager to discuss how they could implement these ideas in their own countries and companies. But soon, the realities of scaling began to set in. There were resistances from sectors that had built their entire foundation on profit-first models. Businesses with decades of dominance in industries like finance, energy, and tech weren't quick to give up their long-standing formulas for success. Some saw our message as idealistic, too rooted in emotion and not enough in numbers. I knew that to truly revolutionize the world, we had to meet them where they were. We needed to prove that prioritizing people over profits wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the smart thing to do. I remember one particularly intense conversation with a CEO of one of the largest multinational corporations in the world. He was all about growth, year-over-year increases, market share expansion, and maximizing returns. "Carlos, I understand what you're saying," he said, leaning forward in his sleek, glass-walled office. "But the world doesn't work this way. We can't just build businesses on good intentions. We need results, numbers, a clear ROI." I took a deep breath and leaned in. I had heard this argument many times before, and I knew this would be the make or break moment for some of these skeptics. "You're right," I said, "the world does need numbers, but here's what you're missing. When employees feel valued, when they trust the leadership, they don't just work harder, they work smarter. When customers feel heard, they become loyal advocates, not just one-time buyers. When you invest in people, you invest in the long-term sustainability of your business." He paused, clearly taken aback by my response. For a second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe it was doubt, or maybe it was curiosity. "So you're telling me that focusing on people will make us more profitable?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "Not just more profitable," I replied. "It'll make you more resilient, more innovative, and more capable of weathering storms." People-first companies have lower turnover rates, higher employee engagement, and stronger customer loyalty. The data doesn't lie. We've already seen the evidence. Now it's about shifting mindsets. We talked for another hour. By the end of our conversation, he was more open to the idea, but I knew this wouldn't be the last conversation we'd have on this subject. Changing such ingrained corporate ideologies takes time. Meanwhile, back at the People First Foundation, our focus shifted from international awareness to practical implementation. Workshops, training programs, and advisory services were developed to help organizations embed this new philosophy into their day-to-day operations. We worked closely with companies of all sizes, helping them align their leadership, employee engagement, and customer relationships with a people-first approach. Then, a breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A small startup in Silicon Valley, struggling to stay afloat in a competitive market, reached out to us. Their founder, Daniel, was a young visionary who had built his company on the promise of innovation, but was finding it difficult to scale. He wasn't just looking for a financial boost, he was looking for a way to build a company culture that would support sustainable growth. At first, it seemed like another run-of-the-mill case. But when I met with Daniel and his team, I saw something different. They weren't just focused on profits. They wanted to create something that mattered. They wanted to do business differently. We started working together, helping them integrate people-first principles into every aspect of their company, from recruitment to product development to customer interaction. 3 months later, they launched a new product. It was a massive success, not because of their groundbreaking technology, but because they had built an emotional connection with their customers. They had listened, understood their needs, and made them feel like they were part of the company's journey. They didn't just sell a product, they sold a promise, one that was rooted in genuine care. That success became the model we used to pitch to other companies. The key to their growth was the same as the key to any successful business: people-first leadership. As the years passed, I continued to witness how the people-first movement had infiltrated not just the business world, but also politics, healthcare, education, and more. There was still resistance, yes, but the narrative was changing. People began to realize that success wasn't about quick wins, it was about long-term well-being for everyone involved. And that's when I realized how profound the impact had been, not just on businesses, but on the world itself. And in my quiet moments of reflection, I saw the true extent of this transformation, not just in terms of policies or profits, but in the lives we touched. Employees who once dreaded Monday mornings now looked forward to their work. Customers felt a sense of pride in the companies they supported. Families who had been struggling to make ends meet now found hope through companies that genuinely cared about their futures. As I looked back on everything we had accomplished, I knew one thing for sure: this movement was no longer just about us. It was about creating a world where people came first, not because it was trendy, but because it was the right way to live. Now, I'm sitting in my office, years after the initiative began, and looking at the map of where we've made an impact. There are still challenges ahead, but I can't help but feel that the work we started is far from over. In fact, it's just getting started. The future is here, and it's people first. The years that followed marked the next chapter of the People First Initiative's journey. The foundation had grown into something truly remarkable, touching companies, organizations, and even governments around the world. What started as a small movement had become a global transformation, one rooted in the belief that true success is measured not by financial gain alone, but by the well-being of the people involved. But just as we were beginning to see the fruits of our labor, I realized something crucial. The world wasn't ready to change all at once. There was still resistance. In the corners of the corporate world and government offices, old habits died hard. We had made strides, yes, but the road to true change was never going to be linear, and there were times when that reality weighed heavily on me. One evening, as I sat in my office reflecting on the incredible progress, William walked in, a tired look on his face. The past few months had been draining. We had been busy building alliances, launching new initiatives, and overseeing the growth of our global outreach, but the emotional weight of it all had begun to take its toll on both of us. "Carlos," he said, sitting across from me, "I've been thinking. We've come so far, but there are moments when I wonder, have we truly changed the system, or are we just making incremental progress?" I could see the doubt in his eyes. After everything we had done, William Dornelles, once the epitome of confidence and control, was questioning whether our mission had truly changed the world. I took a deep breath and leaned forward. "We've done more than just make progress, William. We've shifted the conversation. We've made it impossible for people to ignore the importance of putting people first." He nodded slowly but didn't seem convinced. "But is it enough?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost to himself. I paused, thinking for a moment. The doubt in his voice mirrored the questions I had been wrestling with lately. We had transformed organizations, seen real, tangible improvements in employee satisfaction, and had governments begin to adopt our model. But was it enough to create lasting, widespread change? I leaned back in my chair, looking at the walls that surrounded me. The success of the People First Initiative was undeniable, but as the world evolved, so did the challenges. More and more, I found myself wondering if we had only scratched the surface. What if the world needed more than just corporate reform? What if we needed to rethink society as a whole, how we view and treat one another, from the highest level of government to the smallest communities? You know, I said, my voice steady, we're not just fighting for a shift in business, we're fighting for a shift in society, the way people view success, the way they see their value. It's been so deeply ingrained for centuries that change won't happen overnight. William looked out the window, his gaze distant, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. So what do we do? He asked, the frustration evident. We've done everything we can. We've reached the top. We've spread our message. But is that enough? Will it sustain itself? Or are we fighting against a system that's too entrenched to change? I felt that weight too. The challenge wasn't about what we could achieve. It was about making sure our message wasn't a trend that would fade away. It was about ensuring that the world would continue to see the value in human connection long after we were gone. But then it hit me. There was something we had overlooked, something fundamental. It wasn't just about changing business practices or altering government policy. It was about education. I stood up suddenly, feeling a surge of excitement. We've been focused on businesses, governments, and global leaders, I said, pacing the room. But what if the key to lasting change lies in shaping the next generation? What if we started to focus on education, on teaching kids, students, and young adults to see the world the way we do, to see that true success isn't about wealth or status. It's about the people we help and the impact we have on the world. I could see the light in William's eyes as I spoke. This was the next big step. Education was the foundation of everything. If we could teach the next generation to value compassion, empathy, and human connection, we would have built a future that would sustain the People First movement for generations to come. And so, the People First Education Initiative was born. We teamed up with educators, philanthropists, and tech innovators to create a global curriculum focused on empathy, emotional intelligence, and human-centered leadership. It wasn't just about academic success. It was about teaching kids how to build relationships, how to understand others, and how to make the world a better place. We started with pilot programs in schools across the world, from inner-city neighborhoods in the US to rural areas in Africa. The response was overwhelming. Kids who had been taught to value grades and competition began to see that empathy and collaboration were just as valuable, if not more so, than the traditional markers of success. We saw schools fostering inclusive environments where students didn't just aim to be the best, they aimed to help others succeed. The first graduation ceremony from one of these programs was a moment I'll never forget. I stood at the front watching the students proudly walk across the stage, their faces glowing with a sense of accomplishment that was different from the typical academic pride. These weren't just students who had passed their exams. These were students who had learned to value human connection, to understand themselves, and to relate to others with empathy and understanding. This was the future, and just as we had hoped, the ripple effect of this education began to spread. Graduates from the program started influencing their communities, starting businesses that prioritized people over profits, joining organizations that advocated for social justice, and eventually running for public office, bringing the People First values with them. Over time, the People First Education Initiative became a core part of the People First movement, making sure that the values we fought for weren't just in business and government, but were deeply rooted in the future generations. The progress we had made over the past decade was unimaginable, but it was just the beginning. It wasn't just about a shift in how businesses operate. It was about changing how we view success as a society. And that began in schools, with kids who understood that the heart of success was rooted in human connection. As I looked back on everything we had done, everything we had accomplished, I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. But more than that, I felt a sense of gratitude. We had created something that would last, something that would continue to inspire and change lives for years to come. The legacy wasn't just about the work we had done or the lives we had touched. It was about the future we had helped shape, one where people mattered most. And with that, I knew our journey was far from over. As the People First Education Initiative began to take root in classrooms around the world, it became clear that the work we had done up until now had merely set the stage for the most significant change we would ever create. The transformation wasn't just about rewriting the rules of business or politics. It was about rewriting the very framework of how society thought about success. The lessons taught in those classrooms weren't just about empathy or compassion, they were about long-term sustainability. By teaching young people how to listen, how to understand, and how to care for those around them, we were planting the seeds of a new world. A world where people's value wasn't just measured by what they could produce or how much money they could generate, but by the connections they fostered, the lives they touched, and the impact they made. But as we saw more and more communities and governments adopting these principles, a new challenge arose. The world, it seemed, wasn't quite ready to embrace the scale of what we were trying to do. I was at a conference in London when it first hit me. The resistance wasn't just corporate or governmental anymore. It was societal. There were moments when I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me, especially as we tried to scale the people-first philosophy in places where tradition and old systems still ruled. People, particularly in conservative industries, were beginning to question whether this shift was possible in high-stakes, high-pressure environments. People first sounds wonderful in theory, one corporate leader said to me during a private meeting. But how does that work when you're in a highly competitive environment where survival depends on being the best? I paused, considering the question. I had faced challenges like this before, but this time it felt different. The tension in the room was palpable. I knew the traditional models weren't going to work in every industry. Business had always been about pushing ahead, about outpacing competitors and being the first to market. How could we reshape that thinking without causing a complete collapse of the current systems? It works, I said, my voice steady, but it takes time. It's about changing the culture from the inside out. It's not about abandoning competition. It's about redefining what true competition is. He looked at me, intrigued but skeptical. So, what does that look like? Redefining competition? I smiled. It means that success is no longer about being the biggest or the fastest. It's about creating an environment where everyone wins. A rising tide lifts all boats. When you invest in your people, they invest back in your company. At that moment, I realized that we were facing a paradigm shift that went beyond simple corporate strategy. People First wasn't just a business model. It was an entirely new way of thinking about what it meant to succeed in the modern world. Success wasn't measured by who finished first or who had the most resources. It was about the lasting relationships we built, the care we gave to those around us, and the impact we left behind. The conversation with that corporate leader didn't end in agreement, but it didn't end in rejection either. He was interested, and that in itself was progress. The real breakthrough came when we saw companies like Tesla, Patagonia, and even large corporations like Google embracing people-first policies, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because they began to see the benefits: improved employee retention, higher customer satisfaction, and more innovative solutions. These companies were starting to see the truth: a healthy company culture leads to healthier financial performance. Months passed, and slowly but surely, more and more businesses, governments, and organizations started to adopt our model. It was never an overnight success, but each small win felt monumental. We were creating a new wave, a new standard for business, and the work that had started in boardrooms and classrooms was starting to trickle down to the community level. The world was changing, but not all at once. It would take years for the ripple effect to be fully felt, but as I traveled the world, meeting leaders, business owners, and everyday citizens, I could see the shift happening. One day, while walking through a rural village in India, I met a young man named Ravi. He had recently attended one of our workshops on people-first principles. Ravi had grown up in poverty, in a world where survival depended on being the best in everything, whether it was academics, sports, or business. He had spent years trying to rise above his circumstances by constantly competing, by constantly striving to be the best. But when Ravi heard about the people-first philosophy, something inside him shifted. He started a small business, a social enterprise focused on providing clean drinking water to his village. But Ravi did something that was different. He didn't just sell the water. He made sure that the people in the village felt included. He listened to their needs, and his customers became his partners. Ravi's business grew slowly, but it grew in a way that made a difference. His customers didn't just buy from him, they trusted him. They cared about his success because they saw how much he cared about them. Ravi's story wasn't just an inspiring tale of a young man rising above his circumstances. It was proof that people first could work at any scale, from global enterprises to local businesses, and even in individual lives. When I spoke to Ravi, I realized something fundamental about the movement we had built. It wasn't just about businesses or governments. It was about individual people, their lives, their communities, and their futures. We had created a world where everyone mattered, not because they had the most to offer, but because they were valued for who they were. As I stood there in the middle of that small village, surrounded by people who were all working together to improve their lives, I knew that this was what true success looked like. It wasn't about the billion-dollar deals or the big names. It was about changing the lives of ordinary people in extraordinary ways. And as I looked at the bright smiles of the villagers and the people who had been touched by the People First message, I knew that our journey was far from over. We had started something that would last for generations. The future was not just about business success, it was about creating a world that valued people above all else. As the People First initiative gained global traction, I realized something important. While we had made tremendous progress, there was still a long road ahead. The shift in how businesses, governments, and individuals approached success wasn't instantaneous. We had planted the seeds, but now it was about nurturing them, ensuring that they would grow and thrive in the years to come. The more I reflected on our journey, the more I realized that change wasn't something that could be fully achieved through policy changes or corporate programs alone. The heart of the movement was in individual people who were willing to embrace this new vision of success, who understood that prioritizing human connection wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the smart thing to do. It was about creating a world where people were valued for who they were, not just for what they could contribute to a company's bottom line. It was about fostering empathy, compassion, and understanding on a global scale. It was around this time that we began to see the first real signs of the next phase in the People First movement. Leaders from across industries and nations began to reach out with new ideas, eager to create platforms where collaboration and human connection weren't just secondary goals, they were the foundation. The most striking of these calls came from a small nation in Scandinavia, a country known for its progressive approach to education, healthcare, and social welfare. They invited us to help them reframe their entire approach to leadership, not just in government, but across every level of society. The idea was to build a people-first society from the ground up. At first, it seemed like a daunting task, reimagining an entire country's foundation, especially one as well-established as Scandinavia's. But the opportunity was too important to ignore. William and I spent several months working closely with policymakers, educators, and community leaders, helping them integrate human-centered leadership into everything from public health to government accountability. As we worked with the country's leaders, I began to see something remarkable. The shift wasn't just about introducing new policies or initiatives. It was about a mindset, a new way of thinking that went beyond leadership and permeated into every facet of society. From schools that taught children to embrace empathy as much as math, to businesses that measured their success not by profits, but by their impact on people's lives. The concept of profit first was being challenged in real time. Companies weren't just focusing on quarterly returns, they were focusing on long-term sustainability, employee happiness, and the well-being of their customers. They were starting to see the truth. When people are valued, the business thrives in ways money alone can't measure. But as with all revolutions, there were hurdles. Some were institutional, others cultural. People were skeptical. Fear of the unknown reared its head. For decades, businesses had been trained to think of success in terms of numbers, and now they were being asked to embrace something intangible, something that was often hard to quantify. One of the most difficult challenges came when we partnered with a global tech giant, a company whose CEO had built the company from the ground up. His name was Gregory Carter, and he was known for his sharp business acumen, his ability to spot trends, and his aggressive approach to business growth. When we first met him, I could tell that his mindset was very much rooted in the traditional views of success. At first, he resisted the idea of people first, believing that it was too idealistic. Business is about results, he would say. We can't afford to put feelings ahead of the bottom line. But I knew there was potential in him. Gregory wasn't just a businessman, he was a visionary. He had the capacity to see beyond the immediate horizon, and I felt that if he could see the power of people-centered leadership, he would understand its true potential. So, I spent the next few months working closely with him, showing him case studies, walking him through the data, and explaining how companies with strong, empathetic cultures not only performed better, but were more resilient in the face of economic downturns. Slowly, he started to see the bigger picture. The breakthrough came during a particularly tense board meeting. Gregory had been debating whether to roll out a new software platform that would drive higher revenues, but had severe consequences for the employees who would be impacted by it. The decision was critical, and it was clear that it could either solidify the company's market dominance or destroy its internal culture. As the debate raged on, I spoke up. Gregory, what if we looked at this differently? What if we didn't just ask how much this would benefit the company financially, but how much it would benefit the people working for you? There was a brief silence in the room as Gregory paused to think about it. For the first time, I saw a shift in his eyes. Something clicked. In the end, Gregory decided to rework the platform, ensuring it was designed in a way that empowered his employees rather than exploited them. He introduced training programs, higher wages, and flexible work hours for those who would be affected by the change. And to his surprise, not only did the platform launch successfully, but employee satisfaction skyrocketed. The company culture became stronger than ever, and the results were undeniable. As William and I stood in the boardroom after the meeting, watching Gregory shake hands with his team, I realized something profound. We had done it. People First wasn't just a corporate initiative anymore. It was a movement that was changing the world at every level, from individuals to businesses to entire nations. As we continued to push forward with the People First movement, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. We had faced resistance, we had questioned our path, and we had stumbled at times. But each step forward, no matter how small, had proven that the world was ready for change. We weren't just changing industries or companies, we were changing the way people saw themselves. Success wasn't about outpacing the next guy or making more money than the last quarter. It was about creating a world where everyone's worth was recognized, where human connection came first, and where the future was built on empathy. And as I looked ahead, I knew that the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. As we continued to expand the People First movement, the road became both increasingly rewarding and increasingly challenging. We had made progress in so many areas, but now that the idea had gained traction, we had to figure out how to ensure it wasn't just a passing trend. The next step was about sustainability, not just sustaining the movement, but ensuring it could adapt and grow in the face of future challenges. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in a crowded meeting room in Paris with a group of global leaders and business executives, each of them eager to hear more about how they could implement People First into their operations. The atmosphere was charged, and I could sense the anticipation. Everyone in that room had seen the early successes of the movement, but now they were asking themselves, how do we make it last? The question lingered in the air, and I knew it wasn't going to be an easy conversation. After all, sustaining change, true long-lasting change, required more than just passion. It required a fundamental shift in the way people thought about business, success, and even society itself. I stood up at the front of the room, feeling the weight of their expectations on me. The faces staring back at me were some of the most powerful in the world, yet I could feel the same uncertainty I had seen when we first started this journey. How could we build something that would endure? How could we take this movement and ensure it didn't get lost in the noise of daily business? I took a deep breath and began. I'm not going to lie, I said, addressing the group. This isn't going to be easy. Change at this scale is hard. It will take time. But that's the key. We have to be committed to making this a long-term process. It's about retraining minds, reshaping business models, and rebuilding societies from the inside out. We have to embed these principles into the fabric of every system, from education to healthcare to corporate policy. There was a murmur in the room as I continued. We've seen what happens when we focus on the people. We've seen businesses rise, communities transform, and nations begin to rethink what matters. But for this to last, we need more than just top-down change. We need grassroots movements. People who are dedicated to spreading this message in their communities, in their neighborhoods, in their schools. We need leaders who can take the People First philosophy and make it part of their day-to-day decision-making. I paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. As I spoke, I realized that true sustainability was never about trying to force a quick fix. It wasn't about telling people what they should do. It was about empowering them to make the change themselves. You, I continued, looking directly at the audience, are the catalysts. You are the ones who have the power to inspire the next wave of leaders. But that power comes with responsibility. It's not just about making money. It's about creating a legacy of human connection, of compassion, of change that truly serves everyone. It's about building something that won't just thrive in the short term, but that will continue to grow and flourish long after we're gone. The room grew quiet, and I could see the shift in their expressions. These weren't just business leaders, they were now seeing the profound impact they could have, not just on their companies, but on the world. The weight of what we had started was beginning to dawn on them. After the meeting, I felt a sense of exhilaration and exhaustion all at once. It wasn't the first time I had spoken to influential leaders about people first, but something about this meeting felt different. There was a genuine shift in how they were seeing things, no longer just as a way to improve employee engagement or customer satisfaction, but as a way to transform society. The next chapter of our journey was about expanding the initiative into education, as well as deeply influencing public policy. We started working with governments and educational institutions to introduce curriculums that integrated human-centered leadership. But even more than that, we sought to reshape the way we thought about social progress. Our ultimate goal was clear: to redefine success on a global scale, making it as much about the people and relationships we built as about the wealth and power we accumulated. But even as we worked on these large-scale projects, I never forgot what had started all of this. The simple act of paying attention. The moment when I had seen the doctors miss what was happening with Vivian, the matriarch of the family, and how it had set off a chain reaction that had led to something bigger than any of us could have imagined. I realized that the core of People First was something so simple, yet so powerful. It was about looking beyond the surface, about understanding what truly matters. In a world driven by data, numbers, and power struggles, we had learned the value of stepping back and truly seeing people for who they are. As the years went on, we continued to face new challenges, but we were also able to celebrate incredible successes. Governments began to integrate people-first policies, from healthcare reform to educational initiatives that prioritized emotional intelligence and community building. Major corporations started to report improvements in productivity and employee engagement as a result of implementing the principles we had introduced. But the most moving victories were always the personal stories. I remember a message I received from Maria, the young woman in the small village in India who had started her own social enterprise after attending one of our workshops. Maria's company was thriving, providing clean water to underserved communities. But more than that, Maria had built a network of community leaders, all of them dedicated to making sure that the voices of the most vulnerable were heard and valued. Maria's story became a symbol of what could happen when we put people first, not just in business, but in every aspect of life. Now, looking at the global impact of People First, I realized that this movement was more than just about us. It was bigger than any one company, any one leader, any one country. It was about creating a world where human connection was the core of everything, where people weren't just defined by their productivity, their output, or their financial status, but by how they contributed to the greater good. The work we had done and the work that lay ahead wasn't just about creating a better business world, it was about creating a better world. People First had grown into something greater than I had ever imagined, but in that moment, I realized it was never about how big it became. It was about how far it reached and how deep it ran. As the People First movement continued to spread, it became more than just an idea. It was transforming into a global revolution. What started as a shift in business practices had evolved into a broader mission to reshape society's fundamental values. Governments, businesses, and even individual citizens were beginning to look at success in a completely new light. We were creating a world that valued people over profits and where compassion, empathy, and human connection were the driving forces behind progress. But there were still obstacles. As we started seeing greater impact in larger established nations, I began to notice a shift. There was now a fear building in places that had relied heavily on the old systems. Traditional power structures were beginning to fight back. The idea that the focus should be on people rather than profits went against everything these systems had been built upon. One day, I received a message from an unlikely source. Zara Winfield, a high-ranking executive in one of the world's largest financial institutions. Zara was known for her hardline approach to business and had built an empire on high-stakes investments, cutthroat policies, and fast profits. In the past, her company had been a symbol of traditional corporate dominance. Her message read, "Carlos, I need to meet with you. There's something we need to discuss." I couldn't believe it. The same systems that had once rejected the people-first philosophy were now reaching out, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and caution. When I arrived at Zara's office, the atmosphere was tense. She didn't waste any time getting to the point. "Carlos," she began, her voice sharp, I'm going to be honest with you. My company has been struggling. We've been losing clients left and right. Our profits are down, and our employees are disengaged. I've read everything about your philosophy. I've seen the reports, the success stories, the data, but I didn't believe it. Until now. I could feel the weight of her words. She wasn't here to question the validity of people first. She was here because she had seen its power, but there was more. I could tell she was struggling with the cultural shift that would need to happen within her organization. The problem, she continued, is that we're stuck. My team is telling me we need to change, but there's so much resistance. People who have built this company over decades won't just accept this new model. They think it's soft, and frankly, I don't know where to start. I sat quietly, reflecting on what she said. Zara wasn't the first person to feel this way. I had heard it from so many others. Change at this scale was never easy, and the resistance wasn't just from the top executives. It came from every corner of her organization. Zara, I said finally, what we're talking about isn't just a shift in business strategy. It's a shift in culture, in values. You can't force people to believe in something they don't understand. But the question is this, do you believe it's worth it? Do you believe that putting people first can create lasting change? Because if you do, you'll have to be prepared to lead with that belief, even when it feels like everyone else is resisting. She paused. Her eyes softened, and I saw a flicker of realization. It wasn't about convincing others first. It was about leading by example. Zara's company became one of the most challenging yet rewarding projects we had ever taken on. The cultural shift required more than just tweaking policies. It required a deep transformation in values and mindsets. We began with workshops, focusing not just on employee satisfaction, but on how employees could serve each other. We encouraged collaboration, emphasized well-being, and started restructuring leadership to ensure that empathy and connection were at the heart of every decision. But the real test came when we began to measure success differently. The key was to find metrics that weren't just about profit margins and market share, but about the impact the company was having on its employees, on its community, and on its customers. Zara and I worked with her leadership team to set new goals, ones that balance business growth with employee engagement, customer loyalty, and community involvement. Months later, the results were remarkable. Employee turnover dropped dramatically, productivity increased. And perhaps most surprising of all, customer satisfaction soared. It wasn't about cutting corners or sacrificing profits. It was about creating true value for everyone involved. Zara's company had embraced the people-first philosophy, and it wasn't just improving, it was thriving. But what was most gratifying wasn't the financial success. It was the cultural change that had taken place within the company. Zara, once a staunch advocate for traditional corporate practices, now spoke passionately about the importance of empathy in leadership. She was no longer just running a business. She was creating a legacy of change. This story became a beacon of hope for others who had been on the fence. Zara's company had shown the world that it was possible to balance profits and people. It wasn't about choosing one over the other. It was about finding a way to make both work together. Over the next year, the story of Zara's transformation was shared in boardrooms around the world. More companies began to reach out, and the People First initiative became a standard, not just for companies looking to improve their bottom lines, but for organizations that understood the deeper impact they could have on the world. And so the movement continued. We had begun to see real, lasting change. It wasn't just about changing businesses anymore. It was about changing society as a whole. Governments were adopting people-first policies, educational systems were shifting their focus to emotional intelligence and collaboration, and businesses were putting human well-being at the heart of their success. But just when I thought we had achieved what we set out to do, I began to realize that the journey wasn't nearly over. There were still countless people and systems around the world that needed this transformation. The world was waking up, yes, but we had only just begun to scratch the surface. And now, the real work was to ensure that this wasn't just a trend, but a permanent shift, one that would echo for generations to come. The journey of the People First movement continues, with the legacy we've built now serving as a foundation for a future where human connection and compassion are the driving forces of success. As I look ahead, I know that this is not just about making the world a better place. It's about creating a world where everyone's voice matters, where every person is valued, and where humanity itself thrives. The real change I realized had always been in the hands of people, and together we were building something that would endure long after we were gone. True success was within reach, and it was people first. As the People First movement grew, the world began to shift in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. What started with a handful of businesses, a few governments, and a growing group of believers had now turned into a global wave of change. The work we had done over the past decade was finally starting to show its full potential, but there were still many challenges ahead. Some expected, others completely unforeseen. One of the most significant challenges we faced was the emotional resistance that some sectors of society still held. As we continued to make strides, there were those who had invested so deeply in the old model of success, one that was built on competition, profit-driven growth, and individual achievement, that the very idea of shifting to a people-first mentality felt like a personal threat. I vividly remember a heated discussion with a group of business tycoons at a global summit in Dubai. These were powerful figures, executives who controlled multi-billion-dollar companies and had built empires from the ground up. When the topic of people first came up, the tension in the room was palpable. One of them, Lucas Henson, a well-known CEO of a leading tech company, leaned in with a skeptical expression. "I don't understand this obsession with people. What are we supposed to do? Give away profits? How can we expect to compete on a global stage if we're putting people's feelings before profits? In my world, success is defined by results, not kindness." His words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment I felt a familiar knot of frustration in my stomach. But I had learned by now that resistance wasn't something to fear, it was something to understand. It was a symptom of a deeper belief, one rooted in a lifetime of doing things the same way. I took a breath and looked around the room, gathering my thoughts before responding. "Lucas, I hear you," I began, "and I get why it sounds like we're asking you to throw away everything you've worked for. But what if I told you that embracing people-first leadership doesn't just save lives, it saves your business? Think about this. When employees are truly valued, when they feel heard and supported, they work harder, they're more engaged, they innovate, and they stay longer. When customers feel that a company cares about their experience, their needs, and their well-being, they don't just buy, they become your loyal advocates." Lucas sat back, still skeptical but intrigued. The room fell silent, as if they too were starting to question what they had believed for so long. The conversation turned to case studies and real-world examples of companies that had embraced people-first principles and seen tangible results. Companies like Patagonia, Salesforce, and Warby Parker. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving in an environment that prioritized human connection over numbers alone. The debate that day wasn't just about ideas, it was about convincing people to take action. The old way was all they knew, but the new way was challenging everything they had built their careers on. Still, there was change in the air, and though not everyone in that room was convinced, there was a shift. People were listening. Meanwhile, back in the United States, we were working with state governments to integrate people-first principles into public policy. Some states had already begun adopting people-centered approaches to education and healthcare, but public policy reform was an entirely different beast. It took more than a few successful pilot programs. It took years of advocacy, compromise, and strategic partnerships. California was one of the first states to embrace a large-scale pilot program designed to measure not just economic growth, but community well-being. The goal was to create policies that prioritize mental health, education, and equal access to opportunity. We faced strong opposition from traditional power structures, particularly from industries like big oil and pharmaceuticals that had been benefiting from the status quo. But the data didn't lie. When the state began investing in well-being, it saw improvements in everything from crime rates to economic productivity. People were healthier, happier, and more connected to their communities. One evening, while speaking with one of the policy advisors who had helped spearhead the initiative, I learned that the program had led to more significant long-term gains than anyone had predicted. The healthcare system, once burdened with expensive emergency care, was shifting toward preventative care. Mental health programs and community engagement were becoming priorities. People weren't just being treated, they were being cared for. Despite these successes, we still faced pushback. The entrenched systems that valued profit over people weren't going down without a fight. There were moments when the struggle felt endless, when it seemed like for every step forward, we took 2 steps back. But each victory, no matter how small, proved that the people-first approach was worth the fight. One morning, while reflecting on the path ahead, I thought back to the early days, when all we had were ideas, a few passionate supporters, and a vision for a better world. We had no idea that one simple observation about what I saw happening with Vivian Dawson's health would lead to something so much greater than we had ever imagined. The real success was never in changing the system overnight. It was in creating a movement that was sustainable, one that could adapt and evolve over time. It was about building a culture of empathy, one person, one organization, one community at a time. We knew that for People First to be truly transformative, it had to become part of the fabric of society, not just a movement for business or government, but a global shift in values. And every victory, no matter how big or small, added to that transformation. A few years later, William and I stood together, looking at the global map of where we had made the most impact. We saw entire regions, from Europe to Africa, Asia to the Americas, embracing People First leadership. Educational systems had transformed, with curricula focused on empathy, problem solving, and collaboration. Healthcare systems were moving toward prevention and community-centered care. Businesses were thriving in ways that had once seemed impossible, and the shift was real. But the biggest victory wasn't the accolades or the headlines. It was seeing the human faces of people who had been part of the change. People who had embraced the People First model and changed their lives and the lives of everyone around them. As I looked at the world we had helped build, I realized that the true success wasn't in how far we had come. It was in how far we would go together. As the People First movement continued to unfold, I started to realize that the transformation we had sparked was far deeper than I had initially imagined. It wasn't just about businesses shifting their practices or governments adopting more compassionate policies. It was about changing the very way we think about success, not just in boardrooms or policy offices, but in our daily lives. We had started a movement that was now a global force, but the work wasn't over. The world was changing, yes, but not at the pace we had hoped. While progress had been made, there were still countless corners of the world where the old ways were clinging on. And there were still individuals, leaders, corporations, and governments who were afraid of the vulnerability that came with the People First approach. The more we advanced, the more I realized that change at this scale required more than just new systems. It required a cultural reset where every individual, from the highest ranking official to the average worker, understood the true value of human connection. It required rethinking what it meant to be successful in a world that had long defined success by wealth and status. In the global south, where inequality was rampant and systemic, the shift toward people first thinking had created a spark of hope. But even there, old wounds ran deep, and economic pressures often meant that the people, the very ones we were trying to help, were caught in the middle of conflicting ideologies. One day during a trip to Brazil, I met with a local activist named Luisa, who had spent her entire life working to provide better education, healthcare, and economic opportunities for underserved communities. Her work was groundbreaking, but she often found herself battling a system that didn't always value the needs of the people at the bottom. When we sat down to talk, I could see the passion in her eyes, the same passion that had driven me to start this journey in the first place. "Carlos," she said after a long pause, "I see the power of what you've built, but here, in the favelas, people don't just need empathy and care. They need action. The government promises change, but we've been waiting for years. How do we make sure this isn't just a nice idea for the privileged? How do we make sure that People First isn't just another talking point, but something real for people who have suffered their whole lives?" Her words hit me like a jolt of electricity. I had been so focused on scaling our message, on reaching the boardrooms and institutions, that I had overlooked one fundamental truth. The heart of People First was always about making sure no one was left behind, and that meant giving every voice a chance to be heard, especially those that had been silenced for so long. I promised Luisa we would do more. We had to engage the communities directly, get them involved in the process of change, and ensure that People First wasn't just a top-down initiative, it had to be grassroots. We launched a new initiative aimed at empowering communities in the Global South, focusing on education, job creation, and healthcare access. We partnered with local leaders like Luisa, grassroots organizations, and international donors to create sustainable projects that would be community-owned and operated. What we found was extraordinary. By shifting the focus from charity to empowerment, we were able to help communities take ownership of their own futures. The people we were helping weren't just passive recipients of aid, they became active participants in the change process. And that, I realized, was the key to making People First a lasting transformation. As these projects began to show results, the message started to gain momentum. Local governments saw the tangible benefits of investing in people, and businesses that supported the projects began to see the positive return on their investment, not just in profits, but in community goodwill and loyalty. But even with these victories, I knew we couldn't afford to rest on our laurels. As the movement grew, so did the challenges. The resistance from old power structures only intensified. In some regions, where industries like oil and mining had long been the backbone of the economy, people first felt like a threat to their very survival. There were moments when I questioned whether we could keep up the momentum. Could we truly reshape the entire global economy? Could we turn the tide in industries where the people-first model seemed like a radical ideal? There were days when I was overwhelmed by the weight of it all, but every time I doubted, I would think of the faces of the people we had helped, of Louisa, of Maria, of the countless workers and employees who had embraced the idea of caring for each other and building better futures together. One evening, as I sat reflecting on all we had accomplished, I received a call from William. His voice was filled with excitement as he spoke. "Carlos, I've just heard from an organization in India. They want to partner with us to launch a global education initiative focused on human-centered leadership. They've been watching our progress, and they're ready to start integrating our principles into their own educational systems. This could be huge. We're not just impacting companies, we're changing the foundation of society." I felt a rush of adrenaline. This was the breakthrough we had been waiting for. This was the next frontier for people first, shaping future leaders, teaching them that the key to success wasn't about being the smartest or the wealthiest, but about being the kindest, most compassionate, and most empathetic leader. The Global People First Education Initiative was born, designed to teach the next generation of leaders that success was about service, about impact, about people. It wasn't just about making money or winning competitions. It was about making the world a better place. As we move forward with this new initiative, I could see the future unfolding before me. The next generation of leaders was going to shape the world in ways we couldn't yet imagine. We had planted the seed, and now it was time for them to take it and grow it into something even more powerful than we had dreamed. The journey was far from over, but I knew that People First had already changed the course of history. We had created a world where success was measured not by wealth or power, but by how we treated each other. A world where human connection wasn't just a catchphrase, it was the foundation of everything. Looking ahead, I saw a world where empathy and compassion were not just ideals to strive for, but the driving forces behind every decision, every action, every policy. The future was no longer about competition at the expense of others. It was about building collaboration, care, and sustainability for all. And as I watched the world change, one person at a time, I realized that this was the future we had dreamed of. A future where people weren't just working to survive, they were working to thrive together. As we launched the Global People First Education Initiative, we began to witness the ripple effect that would transform societies on a profound level. The initiative was more than just a curriculum. It was a comprehensive shift in how we approach leadership, success, and collaboration. Schools around the world, from Africa to Asia, adopted this people-centered leadership model, and what began as a series of educational programs slowly began to change the way society operated at a larger scale. But even as the next generation embraced the people-first philosophy, I couldn't help but think about the deeper societal changes still needed. Education was a powerful tool, but it alone wouldn't be enough to completely reshape the world. We had to rethink systems and structures that had been in place for centuries. The corporate world, governments, and communities needed to align on a fundamental level, and that meant tackling some of the most entrenched beliefs about power and profit. One of the most important moments in this next chapter came when I was invited to a summit in Geneva, a gathering of the world's most influential politicians, business leaders, and philanthropists. The summit was meant to discuss global challenges, from poverty and inequality to climate change and access to education. But there was an underlying question that loomed over the event. How can we truly create a world that values people and sustainability over profit and exploitation? The summit room was filled with people whose influence and decisions shaped the future of humanity. But as I stood there, I realized that many of them still saw the people-first philosophy as an ideal, something that sounded good in theory but was difficult to implement in practice. Carlos, one of the UN ambassadors, said during a discussion, "You're talking about creating a new model, a new world order. But the reality is, the world runs on money and power. We have to be pragmatic. If we focus too much on the human side, we risk losing everything." It was a sentiment I had heard before, but this time it struck me differently. This was the real test. The world was ready for change, but many of the most powerful figures in it were still hesitant to take the leap. I agree with you, I said, my voice steady. The world does run on money, on systems that have been built for centuries. But what if we looked at it differently? What if success wasn't just about how much you can extract, but about how much you can give back? What if we measured a nation's success not just by GDP, but by the health of its citizens, the education of its youth, and the well-being of its people? There was a pause in the room. It wasn't the first time these ideas had been raised, but there was something about the way I spoke that seemed to catch the attention of the group. We have to think of success as a shared goal, not just for one country or one company, but for the global community. If we only focus on profits and power, we'll leave too many people behind, and the cost of that will be felt in ways we can't even imagine. Over the next few days, I spoke with leaders from all over the world, many of whom were still skeptical but open to the idea. Some were curious, others were intrigued, and a few were adamant in their belief that the old system couldn't be overturned. But there was a shift in the air. More leaders began to question the status quo, to think about what kind of legacy they wanted to leave behind. By the end of the summit, we had made significant strides. We hadn't just spoken about change, we had started conversations that would lead to real action. Several countries, including Germany, Japan, and South Africa, agreed to pilot large-scale programs focused on people-first policies, not just in business, but in healthcare, education, and public services. The first step was to redefine the way success was measured in these countries. But it wasn't just about government policy. The private sector was where the biggest impact could be made. Companies had the power to change the world, not only through their products, but through the way they treated their employees and customers. After the summit, I received a call from Amazon, one of the largest companies in the world. The request was unexpected. Jeff Bezos wanted to meet with me. For years, Amazon had been criticized for its treatment of employees, its lack of focus on well-being, and its hyper-competitive culture. But now, they were looking to change. Carlos, Jeff said when we finally met, we've seen what you've done with people-first leadership, and I want to know, how do we make this part of our DNA? We've been about growth, innovation, and efficiency, but I believe it's time we put people first. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Amazon wasn't just asking for advice, they were looking to transform. We spent months working together, crafting a new model for employee welfare, customer care, and corporate responsibility. The idea was simple: growth without compromise. If Amazon could thrive while prioritizing its people, then the rest of the world would have to take notice. The transformation was slow at first. The company needed to overhaul its internal culture, rethink its approach to worker benefits, and reimagine how it interacted with its customers. But gradually, the changes began to take hold. Employee turnover rates dropped, job satisfaction increased, and customer loyalty surged. By the end of the year, Amazon had become one of the leading examples of how people-first leadership could be integrated into the world's most competitive industries. These partnerships with Amazon and other industry giants showed me that it was possible to scale the people-first philosophy, even in the most profit-driven environments. The real challenge had never been about convincing people that kindness and empathy were important. The real challenge was showing them that people-first leadership wasn't just a moral choice, it was a strategic advantage. As we moved into the next decade, I began to see something that made me believe in this movement more than ever before. Real change was happening. Slowly but surely, we were creating a world where people weren't just seen as tools for success, but as partners in building a better future. There was still much work to be done, but as I reflected on the journey, on the small victories, the setbacks, and the countless lives touched, I knew that the foundation we had laid would outlast. People First was no longer just a movement, it was a revolution that had touched every corner of the world. And as I looked toward the future, I knew the best was yet to come. As People First gained momentum, the world began to shift in ways that were almost unimaginable when I first started this journey. The idea that success could be measured by the well-being of people, not just profits, was taking root. Yet, even though we had made significant progress, there were still mountains to climb, especially when it came to influencing the deeply ingrained structures of traditional industries and governments. The next phase of our work required a bigger vision, a more inclusive approach. We realized that to truly create a world where people first was embedded in every aspect of life, we would need to connect individuals with systems, organizations, and governments in ways that had never been done before. It wasn't just about policies or corporate practices, it was about people power, the collective force of individuals who, when they banded together, could change the world. We needed to empower communities, reimagine leadership, and create a future where every person, no matter their background, had access to opportunity and respect. One of the turning points came when we began to work with the United Nations, who had watched the People First movement grow over the years. At first, the UN had been cautious. They were hesitant about partnering with a movement that seemed to be more idealistic than practical. But the results we had achieved in businesses, governments, and communities worldwide began to speak for themselves. They couldn't ignore the impact we were making. The UN saw that our initiative was no longer just a corporate philosophy. It had become a global movement. As nations began to adopt the principles of human-centered leadership, we were offered a chance to form a global task force, an effort that would redefine international relations, global governance, and international policy. The first project was ambitious. We were tasked with creating a set of global people first goals, modeled after the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, but with a specific focus on human connection, empathy, and social equity. The goal was to ensure that nations didn't just focus on economic growth, but on improving lives, to create a global society where human dignity and well-being were the most important measures of success. The task was monumental. The scope of the project felt almost impossible. How could we persuade countries with entrenched political systems and economic dependencies to prioritize human rights, equality, and compassion? How could we convince them to measure success by the happiness of their citizens and sustainability rather than by GDP or military power? But as always, we had a secret weapon, the power of real stories. We started by gathering data, but not just cold, hard numbers. We collected stories of individuals who had been affected by people-first policies, communities that had flourished after adopting human-centered leadership, children who had benefited from educational systems built on empathy and collaboration, families who had been lifted out of poverty because governments had invested in well-being. One of the most powerful stories came from Kenya, where a rural community had implemented a local version of our People First program. Olivia, a mother in the community, spoke about how the program helped bring clean water, education, and healthcare to her village. Before the initiative, Olivia and her neighbors struggled to make ends meet, but now they were thriving. They had built a sustainable cooperative business, trained locals in leadership skills, and were able to send their children to school. Olivia's story became a turning point for many skeptical leaders in the UN. It wasn't about the economic potential of the program, it was about the people. It was about the lives that had been changed by community-led solutions. The stories of these individuals became the heart of our presentation. The Global People First goals began to take shape. We proposed initiatives that included global education reform, rethinking education to focus on empathy, collaboration, and emotional intelligence. Healthcare for all, ensuring every human has access to affordable, quality care, and prioritizing mental health alongside physical health. Human-centered economics, moving beyond GDP as a measure of success and considering the well-being of citizens, income equality, and community vitality. Sustainable development, creating solutions that are not just profitable, but environmentally responsible and socially just. Empathy and leadership, promoting leadership based on compassion, respect, and cooperation at all levels of government and business. As the United Nations voted to adopt the Global People First goals, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of accomplishment. This was the moment we had been working towards. People First policies were no longer just a corporate philosophy, they were global standards. And while there was still a long road ahead, we had shown the world that true success wasn't about how much wealth we accumulated, but how we treated each other and how we built a world where everyone could thrive. But even as we celebrated this monumental achievement, I knew the real work had only just begun. Governments would need to implement these policies, and corporations would need to adopt them into their business models. There would be pushback, and there would be setbacks. But we had done something powerful. We had ignited a global conversation, and that conversation was only growing louder. In the months following the UN vote, we began to see real, tangible changes. Countries that had previously been resistant to social reforms were starting to engage. Local governments began introducing policies that aligned with the People First model. Businesses that had been hesitant about making the shift toward human-centered practices were now looking to lead the charge. The world was, in many ways, beginning to take a leap forward, but the most incredible part of all of this wasn't the policy changes or the economic impact, it was the people. As we traveled from city to city, community to community, we saw that change was happening at the grassroots level. People were empowering each other. The shift was happening not just in boardrooms, but in everyday lives. There was still so much to be done, but I had come to understand one powerful truth. People are the true engine of change. No matter the obstacles, no matter the resistance, the human spirit had shown that when it was given the space to flourish, it could achieve the impossible. The People First movement wasn't just a philosophy, it wasn't just a business model. It was a call to action, a shift in how we viewed success, and a blueprint for a world where human connection was the true measure of prosperity, and the world was finally starting to listen. The sun was setting on a quiet evening in New York, casting long shadows over the city that never sleeps. But tonight, the usual hum of traffic and chatter felt distant as I sat on the balcony of the office that had once been the birthplace of the People First movement. The world had changed. We had changed it. I watched as the lights flickered to life across the skyline. New York was one of the first cities where People First had gained traction, and now, looking at the city's skyline, I felt a deep sense of pride in everything we had accomplished. It wasn't just the global policies, the corporate shifts, or even the international agreements that defined our success. It was the stories, the countless lives that had been touched by our philosophy. The families who had thrived, the communities that had flourished, and the individuals who had learned that their worth wasn't measured by how much they could earn or produce, but by their human connection. The phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was William. "Carlos," he said, his voice full of excitement. "Do you remember that conversation we had years ago when we first spoke about making the People First movement global?" I smiled, recalling the early days of our partnership when it had seemed like a crazy dream. We had been just two individuals fighting against an entire system, and now the dream had turned into a global reality. Of course I remember. It feels like a lifetime ago. "Well," he continued, "the world is listening. I just got off a call with the World Economic Forum. They're ready to discuss incorporating People First principles into the next global summit. This is our chance to truly show that what we've started is here to stay. It's not just a movement, it's a revolution." The excitement in his voice was contagious. I could feel the weight of what we had achieved, but I also felt the responsibility that came with it. It was never just about changing systems, it was about changing hearts and minds. It was about ensuring that the next generation of leaders, entrepreneurs, and citizens would see the world through the lens of human connection. I looked out at the horizon, the world sprawling before me. We had set a course, but it wasn't just about where we were headed. It was about what we were leaving behind. Years earlier, I had walked into the boardrooms of global corporations and the offices of government officials, uncertain of whether they would embrace the People First philosophy. Today, we were invited to shape the future of global policy, from education to healthcare, from business practices to social justice. Our ideas had gone from revolutionary to institutional, and yet it wasn't the policies or the regulations that filled me with the most pride. It was the individuals who had taken People First into their own hands, who had embraced its values in their homes, in their communities, and in their workplaces. We had always said that true leadership began with the people. The real impact was in the everyday acts of kindness, the small gestures that reinforced the idea that human connection mattered more than anything else. A few months later, we stood at the stage of the World Economic Forum. Leaders from around the world had gathered, all with the common goal of making the world a better place for future generations. We were invited to speak on how People First had reshaped not just the business landscape, but society itself. It was a full circle moment as I stood there, looking out at the sea of faces. From government leaders to corporate titans, I realized something profound. The world had been changed, but it wasn't just because of what we had done. It was because of the millions of people who had embraced the movement. The true impact of People First was in how it had empowered individuals to become leaders in their own right. The speech was brief, but the message was clear. We had created a movement that valued humanity above all else. A world where success wasn't measured by profits or power, but by the well-being of people. We had proven that human connection was not just a moral choice, it was a strategic advantage. "We've changed the conversation," I said from the stage, "but we are just getting started." People First isn't a trend, it's a movement, and it's here to stay. It's about every one of us finding our value in our shared humanity, not just our achievements. It's about creating a world where the connection we have with each other is the true measure of success. This is our legacy, and it's a legacy that will echo for generations. The room erupted in applause, not because of the grandiosity of our words, but because the truth of it resonated deeply. People First was no longer an abstract idea. It was the future. It was the new way of doing business, of leading governments, of fostering communities. As we walked off the stage, William turned to me, his face breaking into a smile. "I never imagined we'd get here," he said. "But we did, together." We paused, looking out over the crowd, a crowd that now understood the message we had been preaching for so long. We had built something that would endure, something that would influence the future in ways we couldn't even foresee. Years from now, when I look back on this journey, I know I'll remember the moments of doubt, the struggles, and the setbacks. But more than that, I'll remember the people, the millions of people who believed in the vision, who embraced change, and who were committed to building a better world for everyone. We didn't just change business practices. We didn't just create new policies. We changed the world by changing how people treated each other. And as I reflect on everything we've achieved, I know that the real legacy of People First isn't in what we accomplished, but in the future we've paved for the next generation of leaders, thinkers, and creators. This is just the beginning. The world we've worked to build is just beginning to take shape, and the future will be one where people matter most. The end of one journey is always the beginning of another, and this journey, it will continue for generations to come.